Welcome to Content with Character, the weekly podcast that'll give you the momentum you need to create content with more ease, clarity, and laughter. I'm your host, content copywriter Emily Aborn, and I'm all about unconventional marketing approaches. I believe in your big ideas, and I'm excited to help you share them in a way that's distinctly you. Last week on the show, we talked all about being in the podcast guest seat, some tips and considerations, benefits of being a guest, and some ways to get started finding those opportunities. So if that piques your interest, make sure to go back and check out that episode, but do it after this one, because this week we're talking about being the podcast host. I'll be sharing from my experience in being a host of 6 years and give you ideas on content, marketing your podcast, finding guests, putting your listeners first, and more. Hello and welcome back. We are going to get right into it today. So I'm going to take a quick minute right here at the top and just introduce myself, just in case this is your first time listening. I like to tell you who I am and what this is all about. I'm Emily Aborn. I'm a copywriter and a podcaster, as you can probably tell by the sound of my voice, who is on a mission to help you make your marketing efforts less marketing-y. That's a new word. I get that it's no walk in the park to be a business owner. I get that it's not easy to market a business and create content and all that jazz. And I'm here to help make it a little easier than navigating a maze with a blindfold on. Okay, that's the goal. I just don't want you over there making it harder than it needs to be. So that is why I sit behind this mic week after week and put these episodes out for you. If you want to connect more with me, if you want to leave a voice message or shoot me a text or an email, all the links are always in the show notes to get all of the places. If you don't know where the show notes are, you can visit emilyaborn.com, which will also get you to all the places, or you can hand your phone to somebody else and ask them to help you find the show notes. And there you have it. Hopefully they can help and they're more technologically savvy if you don't know where they are. Okay. As I mentioned last week, we did get into all of the pros of podcast guesting and how it can benefit our businesses, who the value really is for. This week, we're going to turn the mic around, not literally, but figuratively, and we're going to talk about being a host. So this episode is for you if you are a current podcast host, or you would like to become a podcast host, aka you would like to start a podcast, or you know somebody who wants to start a podcast and you can share this episode with them, or you're just bored and need something to listen to for a half hour while you match socks and fold laundry. It may also help you if you're looking for more insight into the world of podcast hosts and you kind of want to get a little bit more inside their brain. So let's get into it. As I've shared many times, my podcast hosting journey began in 2019 when I started my first podcast, my She Built This podcast. If only I knew then what I know now. If only I knew then what I know now. I will just say that. Now, I started my podcast because at the time I wanted a podcast that highlighted and featured, put the spotlight on New England women building businesses. It was more focused on New Hampshire women, but it was just kind of like New England. We had people from Maine and Massachusetts and such as well. So my business looked a little bit different then. I actually was way more diversified in what I was offering. I was what I called a professional assistant, and I was kind of like a virtual assistant with a few more bells and whistles, I guess, or a few more service offerings. Like I also did things in person and stuff like that. So my business looked very different, and I did not have much clarity or a clear goal in starting the podcast. Like I said, the goal was just like spotlight other women. It was okay then, or a little bit more okay, I'll say, because there was less noise and competition in the podcasting world in general. But I'll say this, by not really being clear from the get-go and having kind of no direction, I set myself up for a lot of unnecessary floundering because I didn't have any kind of goal or plan. I just kind of went for it and decided I would figure it out along the way. Now, I say all that, and I also don't regret my journey. That's a lot of how I navigate life, and it's been a blessing and a curse, and I ping pong both ways. So trust me, sometimes I learn the hard way. Sometimes I take way too long to think about something before I do it. But now I'm on the other side of all that, that quicksandy feeling and that wiggling around. I feel like I've really walked away with some lessons that I'm able to like share with those coming behind me or those coming alongside me that really would have helped me at that time. And so that's kind of what I wanted to put today's episode together with the intention of. Now, in drastic contrast, this podcast, Content with Character, was the total opposite experience. And I can tell you, I was extremely clear from the get-go. And of course, I'm still learning all the time. I'm still figuring this all out right with you. But it's a far more settling and soothing road, which is interesting because I was about 200 plus episodes into the other podcast. She Built This, and I'm only about like 60, 70 into this one. And I already feel more like clear and more concise and more relaxed in it all. And maybe that's from doing all those other episodes. I don't know. But this is what I was kind of thinking for today. I was kind of thinking, okay, what are some of the questions that people ask me? I've been working with a lot of people lately who have been like wanting to brainstorm content for their podcasts and also brainstorm like how they're actually going to go about like marketing it and what it should focus on and who it should speak to and all of this stuff. So I thought, let's sit down and do kind of like you and I are chatting and you're asking me questions and I'm answering them. And this way you'll also be able to start, if you have had any of these questions or you're starting to turn some of these thoughts around in your own head, even if you're a current podcaster, this might help you to consider some of these other sort of perspectives as well. So here's the question du jour, and I get asked this a lot. Should I start a podcast? People will say things like, well, there's already so much noise out there. I hear that it takes a lot of time. It seems really hard. How do I even do it? How will I market it? And it's like, okay, those are great questions to ask, but let's pull back and just start with the first question at hand that will help you to answer, should I start a podcast? And that question is, why do you want to start a podcast? So there are so many good reasons, and I'm going to just share a couple of them with you. Here are just three. Okay, this is just three of the many, many reasons. Number one is to connect with the guests that you're going to be having on your show. Podcasting is a great networking tool. Now, as a host, you get to bring something really, really valuable to the table to offer guests. And you're also bringing something really valuable to the table for your listeners. So you're kind of like in the driver's seat. You get to unlock all of these fascinating conversations. And you're often, I think, in a hosting position, you're often fast tracking a lot of that relationship building. And it's like a, I said this last week, but it's like a productive networking call. Like it's super productive. So, and you're creating content at the same time. So that's number one, is like connecting with guests, also connecting with listeners. Okay. The second reason, another why, is that it can be a resource library or serve as a way to support clients or your community. It's such a great way to share ideas, share information, build credibility, educate people, show your expertise. It's a perfect opportunity to give value to your clients, your potential clients, your community, just fans, right? So with each and every episode, you're really building this like resource library. You're building a catalog of topics for your potential clients. And I love that about it. And then a third why might be to actually convert listeners and turn them into leads so that you can start building your business up a little bit more in that way. Podcast is a great way to generate business and grow. It is a great access point, a way to know, like, and trust, where potential customers are able to like begin engaging with your brand before even having to really engage with your brand. And it also helps them to know the steps to take, the things you offer. It moves them along that buyer's journey in a very gentle way, and they're able to start gleaning your expertise, your education right away. If gaining leads is something that you are interested in starting a podcast, I would highly encourage you to check out my friend Alicia Galati's Listeners to Leads podcast, because this is exactly what she focuses on, and she has so many resources in there. I mean, you could listen to every single one of her episodes and you would have more information than you knew what to do with about bringing in leads and growing your business through your podcast. So those are just some of the things. There's also the element of fun and creativity, right? Like it is very fun. It is very creative. It is a creative outlet, and it may just be something like that you've always wanted to do. So there's no wrong answer, but I always like us to start with why, because, and that's a great question to ask, like no matter what you're deciding to take on, even if it's just joining another social media platform, why? So you are right if you think that there is a lot of noise out there. There is. And there is room for you. There is room if you can get clear on what makes you different, what makes you distinct, why now. So think about that for yourself. Like, what would make somebody lean in and be like, ooh, tell me more? This is something I think that I do well with this podcast, and I wish that I had done way better with my first podcast. Like, I just kind of did what a lot of other people were doing with their podcast, and I didn't really know any differently. So, and I also didn't really know how to set it apart from all of those other things. So with this one, I knew I wanted to be different. I knew I wanted to talk about marketing, but I knew I wanted to talk about it in a totally different way. I wanted a human approach. I wanted to talk about some of the real life struggles that seemingly have nothing to do with marketing, but they actually have everything to do with marketing. And I wanted to really embrace my personality and my way of doing things and like my quirky ideas and concepts, which at the end of the day, that's what makes us all different. But you have to ask yourself, what will make me different in this space? Because if you can figure that out, there is room for you and there is not too much noise. I assure you that. So let's talk about time. This is another question that I think it's important to kind of think about. How much time does it take to start a podcast? And how consistent do I need to be in hosting a podcast? Time and consistency are for sure important factors in making your decision. And I wouldn't recommend that you start a podcast or continue a podcast if you're looking to like stop doing one if you don't have time to work on it. If it's just like another thing or just like another box to check or just another nuisance, if you feel like having guests is extremely time consuming and annoying, and keep in mind that having guests is actually more time consuming. Not more annoying, but more time consuming. It might be something that you have to be realistic with yourself and say, you know what? I don't actually have capacity for this right now. So most podcasts, did you know this? Most podcasts don't make it past 7 episodes. I think that the stats currently are that as high as 50% of podcasts pod fade, which means that they just kind of like poof, go away really, really early on. Now, I think some of this is because new podcasters aren't prepared before going in. Maybe they don't have their content planned out or they don't have that clarity. They haven't done that market research. And if this is like a hobby or a passion project, no worries. Go for it. You do that thing, right? But if you want to use your podcast to grow and help your business, you're going to want to make sure that you have time and that you are being a little bit more strategic about it. So let me give you like a little tiny example of how much work is involved and how much time is actually involved. The stats or the guesstimate is that a 1-hour podcast, so recording it, editing it, and producing it, and marketing it, that can actually equate to up to 4 hours of your time. So it does take time and effort. Especially as audio quality standards are higher and listeners' attention spans are shorter, does take time and effort to produce and also market your podcast. So I only say all that because I don't want you to leap in without understanding the work involved, but I also don't want you to shy away from starting a podcast if you're ready to go and you also maybe have a really good solid marketing kind of like strategy in place already. Go for it. Then it comes down to like kind of choosing your frequency. Now, frequency, I always like to say, is not the same thing as consistency. Frequency is literally how often you will produce the show. So weekly, every other month, monthly. There is no magic frequency you need to maintain in being consistent. I will say your audience will be relying on you once you get going to consistently show up in their feed as frequently as you've told them that you're going to do. So if you say you're going to provide a weekly show, provide a weekly show. If you say, I'm going to stop for a length of time, just know that they may also take a little pause until you let them know that you're coming back. So I've also seen in some cases that people, when someone says they're going to stop for a length of time, they unfollow, unsubscribe, stop listening. So if you are going to stop for a length of time, you might say what that length of time is. That way they know not to unfollow, unsubscribe, stop listening. You might want to reassure them, I'm not pod fading, I'm just taking a little break. So that's kind of my thoughts on consistency. I would choose a consistency that works for you. And like I said, there is no magic formula. But once you say how often you're going to produce the episodes, make sure you stick to that. Be true to your word in that. Okay, let's really, I get asked this in different sorts of ways, but kind of how do I format my podcast? And this is something you just need to think about, whether you are a seasoned podcaster or whether you are just starting out. And I'll share this personal kind of example. When I had my She Built This podcast, it was all guest episodes. Now, I decided to do a couple of solo episodes, I think in 2020, when the world was going to where in a handbasket. I decided to do a couple of solo episodes just to kind of test it out and see how I liked it. And I loved it. And then I sort of started bringing in some of my own ideas and expertise in as solo episodes. But it was not until my friend Alicia Galati, I know I've shared her name a lot in this episode, but it's so relevant to being a podcast guest. She sat me down, I had a strategy session with her, and she sat me down and really talked about the importance of me needing to do solo episodes to be able to share some of my educational resources that I wanted to be able to offer people. So she really helped paint the picture for me, with the format you have now, it's not going to help you achieve the goal that you have. So that is something for you to think about. You want to think about who's listening and also what your goal is for that person listening. And then where do guests, solo episodes, long episodes, mini series, limited series, private podcast feed, where does that all kind of unfold within that? Once you've answered those questions, where does that kind of go? So if you're confused, which this part is actually a little bit confusing sometimes, you're I don't know if this format would help me reach my goal. But if you are feeling that way, just ask somebody who can help guide you in the questions you need to ask yourself, or somebody who can clearly say, this is my experience. For somebody like you, this is how you should structure your show. I'm going to include the link to Alicia's strategy session in the show notes because it was so valuable for me in this way, and I would love for it to be a resource for you as well. Okay, is starting a podcast hard? I don't know. Is it hard? No, it seems hard, but it's actually not that hard to start a podcast, especially in 2024. There's an abundance of resources out there. I think you can pretty much do it alone if you're pretty savvy. But the hardest part is showing up consistently. Now, and I've also heard that people sometimes really struggle to come up with content ideas or what they're actually going to talk about. So I think I want to address that. I don't think it's hard per se, but I do think that it helps you to have a plan or to at least have a direction or kind of a goal. Now, this does not apply to everybody, obviously, but for me, with the goals I have for my podcast, it helps. I'm also a planner. I love planning. But I like to have a couple of episodes ahead of time ready to go. Because in my episodes, my goal is really to educate and help you. And so for me, that requires some preparation and some research and some thinking about it. And none of those things are hard per se, but they do take time. I also don't particularly find podcasting hard. I actually find it really, really enjoyable. But if there are pieces of it that you're worried about, the tech can be hard or challenging for some people, it's a very relevant term, obviously, or subjective term, sorry. But if a piece of it is feeling like it's very complicated or hard, you can ask for support. You can outsource it to somebody else that knows what they're doing or has expertise in that area. So that's where working with somebody like my friend Alicia at Galati Media is super helpful. There's other people, of course, but just know that like making it easier is not doing it alone. You don't have to do it alone. And in the very busy, like we talked about at the beginning, noisy world of podcasts, it's not an easy feat to do it alone. I'll just say that. But it's not necessarily something I find to be hard or challenging. But it is something I get asked, so I wanted to address it. Okay, and one of my favorite parts of podcasting is coming up with the content. Okay, this is like the best part of podcasting. Like, what am I going to fill this exciting piece of audio with? Now, I am a planner, like I just said, so I like to kind of create like a month where I have different focuses for the entire month, and then I fit my sort of ideas in there. I also have this massive idea sheet, which is very, very full of ideas. And I like to put new ideas as they pop up there so that I can go back. If I'm ever out of ideas, I know I literally have 200 more waiting for me in the wings. And I can take something that just feels interesting and exciting for me. That way, I'm not always forcing myself to come up with new ideas like on the fly. And I'm certainly not sitting down with like 0% of the content thought out or planned out. Your technique of doing this may look differently, but I love a good like content brainstorm, either before you start a podcast or as you're going in your podcast. So one way this could look is just taking the things that you're an expert in, the things you could literally talk about in your sleep, and breaking them out into subtopics, and then breaking those subtopics out into more and more and more and more subtopics. Like you can literally talk about the same thing 8 different ways. I could do probably 6 podcasts on this exact same topic, and they would all be completely different. So that's where you want to kind of find your content. Like, okay, where can I keep expanding on this idea, expanding on this idea, expanding on this idea? And one of the really fun parts of what I get to do with like strategy stuff with people in their content is brainstorming these ideas together. So it doesn't matter if you're 200 episodes in and you just don't have any new ideas, or if you're just starting out. This is something we can chat about together. But I do think that there's a lot of value in capturing those ideas and kind of having some sort of plan for your content. Bonus points if you're able to repurpose it throughout your content and like kind of make it part of your marketing pillar. Like that is one thing that is so fantastic about having a podcast. It serves as this long form content that you can then repurpose and break down into so many other ways. And hypothetically, oh my gosh, hypothetically, it would be amazing if the only thing I ever really thought about every week was my podcast. And I say that because I wish that I was that strategic and smart about repurposing, but I'm not always that good. And there's also realistically other things that I like to talk about throughout the week. So, but hypothetically, my podcast could be the one and only piece of content I think about all week long and share in different ways throughout my marketing. So think about that too in your content. Like, are there things that you can break out into so many different ways to repurpose it? Okay, there's lots of little other pieces of nuance, like titling your episodes, and do you have fun with them, or do you go an SEO route, how to do your show notes, things like that. And those are all kind of questions you can research pretty easily and get a wide kind of array of education on. I'm going to include some specific articles on those topics, like if you're looking for like a little bit more of a deep dive on those things, but those aren't really things that I want to get into the weeds in, as they say today. I think lastly, I just want to talk about guests and like having guests, because guests add in a totally other factor. I heard recently, I'm so sorry to say this again, but on the Listeners to Leads podcast with Alicia Galati, she had a guest who was talking about a new platform he's created called Brain Bump. Now, I haven't looked extensively into Brain Bump yet, but I do plan to. So his name is Mark Hirschberg. I hope I'm saying his last name correctly. And the episode was called Escape the Social Media Hamster Wheel. So I'll make sure I include that in the show notes. But in his interview, Mark was saying that he has been a guest on over 400 podcast episodes, which is like a lot of guesting. Okay, that is a lot of guesting. And in that, he's really found some things that could help hosts to prepare their guests to be better guests. And some of the tips he gave were fantastic. I'm not going to do them justice, and I would highly recommend you check out that episode. But it was simple things like telling your guest how long you guys are going to be sitting down recording together. So is this a 35-minute interview or is this an hour and a half, right? Letting them know how much you edit the episodes, letting them know who your listeners are. And then any other sort of factors that you need to mention along the way. He really brings those up in a way that was so helpful, I think, as a podcast host who's looking for guests. So remember that bringing in a guest does add in another factor. You need to make sure that they're aligned with the vision that you have for your show. And I really, truly believe that we need to advocate for our audiences first and foremost. So whether that looks like having a guest or saying no to a guest, that is up to you. That's a decision only you can make. But you do have to be you got to have your audience's back, right? You have to prioritize your listener. You are my first priority, always, always, always. And so that's really important to think about when you are choosing and bringing on guests. Now, finding guests, there's definitely not a right way to do it. I've mentioned Podmatch before, which I'll make sure I include a link to in the show notes. There's podcast collaborative groups you can be a part of. There's also, trust me, there are no shortage of people who would like to be a guest on your podcast. It is up to you to make sure that you're finding ones that are a good fit, that are aligned, that are focused on the topics that you want to be bringing to your listeners, and that are helping to set you apart too, right? This is what I really think I love most about podcasting is there is no right way to do it. We all bring our own uniqueness to it. And it really is important to consider all of the kind of behind the scenes stuff, like being clear in your content and having a quality audio and having quality guests. So your goal does not need to be monetary, but I think that having a goal, a clear goal and a clear direction for your show is important. And it also helps to bring the listeners clarity too, which is a huge gift. So, okay. Lastly, I'm going to just wrap it up and say I love being a podcast host. I have always loved it. I think it is such a great way to refine and hone in on our messages. And I think that it's really, really helpful if you know what that message is from the get-go. Okay? And as I say that, I want to say, yes, clarity is key. And with clarity, you're going to keep getting clearer and clearer as you go. So don't wait for this perfectly polished message before you get started. And I'm reminding myself as much as I'm reminding any other hosts listening, but always remember that marketing your podcast doesn't do itself. You have to tell people, and some easy ways to do it are probably things you're already doing, probably marketing tools you're already using, such as email, social media. We talked last week about connecting with podcasters and being a guest on other people's shows. That's such a great way to spread the word about your podcast. Making sure it's on your website, making sure that it does have SEO to some extent, including kind of calls to action and things like that. But I want to leave you with a little bit more big picture inspiration, okay? The possibilities when you decide that you are going to show up and start a podcast, the possibilities are endless. I truly do believe that it is absolutely life-changing to either be a guest on other people's podcasts or to start a podcast of your own, whether it is a long-time podcast or it's a limited series podcast. I don't think it matters. It is life-changing. And it's not as hard as you think it is. It's also not as easy as you think it is. You will learn as you go. It does help, of course, to plan and have a direction and a goal, but don't let yourself get bogged down in that. Don't let yourself get bogged down in being 100% clear. And if you are a new podcaster or a seasoned podcaster and I don't know, you're wondering what am I doing here? Go back to your why. Go back to the intention behind your podcast, why you started it, why you want to start it. What is that message burning inside of you that you want to share? And most importantly, is this something that when you think about it, it just lights you up from head to toe? It is so much easier to stay consistent and to stay faithful and to be excited about something that you commit to when it brings you joy. So let me know if this episode gave you any food for thought. Especially if you're like already a podcaster and you're like, I hadn't thought of that yet. And next week, we're going to talk about something which I see lots of people do over the summer. We're going to be asking ourselves, have we been phoning it in or mailing it in? I'm not sure how the expression goes. Ooh, I just Googled it and it goes both ways. That's so exciting. See, we learned something new today, and you can phone it or mail it. But whether you've been phoning or mailing it in, we're going to get us back on track. Okay, we're going to get back on track. So make sure you tune in next week and I will chat with you then. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Content with Character. If you loved the episode, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast, rate, review, and share it with someone else you know it could help. For more content and visibility tips, visit my blog at emilyaborn.com, and be sure to connect with me on Instagram at Emily Aborn. I'd love to hear how this inspired you to take action.